In Dan in His Van episode 6, I'm going to talk about faults and talk about things like PA amplifiers not working properly, or leads not working, or there's a problem with the guitar amp, or there's all sorts of issues. Now, in my experience as an electronics engineer, because I did that as a degree for 3 years and then worked for a studio for 2 years, in all of that time, the number of times that it was actually catastrophic circuit failure was actually rare. It was, a few times perhaps. Usually what goes wrong with things, let's say we've got a mixing desk or a guitar amp or whatever, and the thing is not working properly, there are a few things to check. And most of it is based on the human interface or contact with the outside world. So, for example, a speaker jack or guitar lead or a microphone, or it could be one of the faders or switches, those sort of things that connect you with the kit rather than things that connect internally. So parts of a power amp or a preamp to power amp, that sort of thing. Now, there are faults like that. I've got a Roland JC120 guitar amp, which actually I went through and replaced all the cables. There's little edge connectors that connect onto the circuit board, and if there's a bit of moisture gets in or they become slightly loose, things like the chorus stop working. But they're easy faults to fix because you just put you hardwire the circuit boards together rather than having a plug. The fewer connectors you have in the chain, like XLRs or jacks or push fit connectors or whatever they happen to be, the fewer you have in the chain, the less likely it is you're going to come up against a problem. So if you get to your gig, for example, and you've plugged your mixing desk into the power amp or the speakers, for example, if they're active speakers, let's say, for example, one channel isn't working. Now, the first thing, and you'd be surprised how many times this happens, but the first thing you've got to think about is it switched on? It's a common thing. Sometimes if you're plugging in a PA and you plug in all the mics and all the monitors and you plug the PA in at the end, why isn't this PA working? It might be that you haven't plugged the PA speakers into the mixing desk. I've seen it happen, and I've seen people tear their house thinking, why is it going on? I can see the power on the speakers. And very often, if you're in a gig situation, the panic sets in and prevents you from going through all the stages and just thinking, okay, why is this not working? Let's have a look. And you follow the course of your signal. So microphone, cable plugged into a mixing desk. Mixing desk output into the PA. Is the gain turned up on the mixing desk? Is the fader down? Is there a switch on the mixer that will stop that mic working? So very often it is human interface that creates the faults that we all know and love at a gig, where you're tearing your hair out and you're trying to make things work. The other problem, of course, is that you turn things up to try and make them work, and then suddenly you press a switch and you get a loud blast which destroys your speakers or whatever. So then you just feel a bit silly afterwards, in addition to having to spend some money. Now, things like the little mini jack connectors that you have that go from your iPod or your phone or whatever into a mixing desk, they don't last very long, really, and you might get a problem with one side. Now, the obvious answer to this is just to use one channel, and that's fine as long as it's not something that's proper stereo like the Beatles, where they had drums on one channel and guitars on another, and then you might not hear you think, this doesn't sound right, this doesn't sound very Beatles, or I can only hear half the Beatles playing, I can only hear 2 of 4. So it can become an issue. Now, jack plugs, if you have a mixing desk that feeds a power amp, for example, and you've connected it up to the speakers and only one channel is working, left or right, for example, there are things that you can do to eliminate the fault. The first thing you should try and do is to go to the jack plugs at the PA amplifier end and swap them over. If the fault tracks, if the fault goes between, goes literally from left to right or vice versa, then the problem is going to be in the cabling or your mixing desk. If, however, the fault stays put, that's going to be a little bit of a trickier one to find out, because it could be that there's a problem with your power amp, or there's a loose connection on the jack, or indeed the speaker, one of the speakers isn't connected. So if the left channel isn't working, you swap the leads and it's still the left channel. It could be this one speaker's not working, or one side of the power amp's not working, or there could be things like a speak-on connector on the speaker that you haven't twisted into full lock. Now, I do fix stuff. I've just been fixing a power amp actually for somebody where one input wasn't working, and it actually turned out to be a hairline crack in the solder. So I had to look very carefully for this. There are circuit things that stop working. I plugged in my Fender amp last week. I've got a Valve Fender Blues Deluxe. Plugged it in and it sounded really awful, really distorted. And what had actually happened is, when I put the plug in the back of the amplifier to store it, the earth pin, or one of the pins of the plug, had obviously hit one of the power valves and put a tiny little hole in it. So if you've got a valve amp that's not working, just look at the power valves, or any of the valves, and if any of them look really cloudy or somehow a bit different, the chances are you've either got a hairline crack in the valve, or there's actually a hole. It was a cartoon style smash out of one of the valves. And of course, when a valve no longer sits in a vacuum, that's it. When you buy new valves, as I did recently, for this particular amplifier, I put both valves in, one of them didn't warm up. Okay, then you have to do things like eliminating that by taking the valves out and plugging them in the other way. And actually the fault stayed with the valve. So the valve was manufactured, it was a Duff. So valves either last 10 seconds or 10 years. And this particular one had no vacuum in it. So you do get problems, components, especially valves. They're not fail-safe. Guitar leads, they wear out. The leads are moving about all the time. Mic leads, they stop working. You can have a mic lead, for example, that stops working, that can actually kill the phantom power supply in your mixing desk. So you've got to be very careful with your leads, to making sure that they all work. You can buy little cable testers. So it has a XLR jack, a phono, and a MIDI and a mini jack each side, and then you just plug in your cable, and then a little switch will tell you, and a series of lights will show you if there's a short circuit or whether everything is working properly. And they're really useful things to have. And they're £20 or something. They're not very much money, and it can save you a lot of hassle, especially when you think of taking the top off an amplifier, thinking, oh, there's something wrong with it. It might be the cables, it might be the source, it might be the speaker, it might be the speak-on that you haven't fully clicked in. It could be any number of things. So when you go to a gig and you are faced with these faults, ideally you will have spare plugs or a spare power amp or a spare something before you pull bits and pieces apart. Now I'm going to be making a series on what happens if there is a fault with the electronics of an amplifier. So I will pull apart one of my amps and show you the components of the power supply and show you little faults that may or may not crop up. Now, of course, it's generic. A Carlsberg amp is going to be different from a PV amp or another transistor amp, or my Crown amp, or whatever it is. Mixing desks will also be different, but you can very often eliminate faults with only basic knowledge, with no maths or physics involved. So there we are. Tracking faults and finding faults doesn't necessarily mean pulling the top off a box, put more cables in, or just check that everything has been switched correctly.